Well, good evening and welcome so much for joining us. I'm Hillary Nather-Dedish, Director of Development at Joslyn Art Museum. And it's so nice to have you joining us. We see the attendees keep growing. I'm so excited for this program and so grateful to our three curators for giving us their time and attention tonight. We're going to be joined, obviously, hopefully you can see, Annika Johnson, Taylor Acosta, and Karin Campbell. Just a few housekeeping items before I turn over to them, because that's who we all want to hear, including myself tonight. But if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat feature with your chat button. And if you have any questions specifically for the curators around their conversation tonight and dialogue and follow-up questions, please use the Q&A. We'll have a limited amount of time for Q&A, but if we don't get to it, we'll make sure we'll follow up with you. If you have any other questions after the fact that you've been thinking about or you'll be thinking about later after this great program, you can always email giving@joslyn.org, and we're happy to help you that way. So without any other pause, I want to introduce Taylor Acosta, our Willis A. Strauss Curator of European Art, as well as the other ladies joining us. And so excited to hear you, and take it away.
Thanks, Hillary. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. And thank you, as always, for your ongoing support of Joslyn Art Museum as members and donors. I'm Taylor Acosta. I'm the Willis A. Strauss Curator of European Art. So I oversee the museum's collection of European painting and sculpture and works on paper from about the late 13th to the early 20th century. And I'm going to let my curatorial colleagues also introduce themselves.
I'm Annika Johnson. I'm Associate Curator of Native American Art, and I curate a very broad collection like Taylor. The Native Art collection encompasses, from as far north as the Inuit communities in the Arctic to pre-Columbian sculpture in Central America. Mostly these works were made in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but we have some older artworks as well.
I'm Karin Campbell. I'm the Phil Wilson Curator of Contemporary Art at Joslyn. Like many museums, my purview isn't just contemporary, it goes back to 1945. So the whole collection after 45, it's mostly American, but with a few other things peppered in. And I'm also the principal curator for the Riley Contemporary Artist Project Gallery, a new space in the museum's history, the first space to ever feature exclusively living artists.
So, tonight's program takes its title from Linda Nochlin's 1971 essay for Art News, which was titled, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" and subtitled, "Implications for the Women's Live Movement, for Art History, and for the Contemporary Art Scene, or Silly Questions Deserve Long Answers." The essay helped to shatter the illusion that art history is universal, and in doing so, it changed the field forever. It was considered perhaps the first major work of feminist art history. It has become required reading for those who study art, as well as in many other fields. And I think each of us can probably remember the first time that we read this essay. The American art historian Linda Nochlin earned a doctorate in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, with an emphasis on realism and the painter Gustave Courbet. She held teaching positions at Vassar, the City University of New York, Yale, and NYU. Her early survey of realism, numerous essays on gendered representation, and Orientalism are seminal texts for both social and feminist histories of art. But she remains best known for the essay, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" The essay was in fact a response to a question from the art dealer Richard Feigen, who said, "Linda, I would love to show more women artists, but I can't find any good ones. Why are there no great women artists?" So in roughly 4,000 words, Nochlin dismantled the question to reveal the assumptions that lie underneath it, as well as to answer or gesture at the answer it sort of insidiously supplies. There are no great women artists because women are incapable of greatness. The essay challenged the myth of male genius and called for an entirely new way of thinking. Nochlin argued that rather than look for and elevate the reputations of overlooked women artists, or assert that there is in fact a different kind of greatness for women's art than for men's art, we should instead question the social and institutional structures that influence the making and viewing of art. She wrote, but in actuality, as we all know, things as they are and as they have been in the arts as in 100 other areas are stultifying, oppressive, and discouraging to all those, women among them, who did not have the good fortune to be born white, preferably middle class, and above all, male. The fault lies not in our stars, our hormones, our menstrual cycles, or our empty internal spaces, but in our institutions and our education. Education understood to include everything that happens to us from the moment we enter this world of meaningful symbols, signs, and signals. It is when one really starts to think about the implications of why have there been no great women artists that one begins to realize to what extent our consciousness of how things are in the world has been conditioned and often falsified by the way the most important questions are posed. Her tone is conversational, but her point is profound. The art world was and is tangled up with politics and power. In the 50 years since Linda Nochlin told us that silly questions deserve long answers, others have taken up the mantle. Theory has transformed the way that academics and critics think about gender and identity in art. And public art institutions have begun to address the widespread gender imbalance in their collections and exhibitions. And yet today, achieving equality is still an ongoing project. We continue to ask questions, to think in new ways, and try to examine art from different angles and different perspectives. So as Nochlin once said, feminist art history is there to make trouble, to call into question and to ruffle feathers. So tonight, I'm hoping maybe we'll do just a little bit of that.
Okay, thanks, Taylor, for that reintroduction to Linda Nochlin. We were joking while preparing for this talk that we felt like we were undergrads again. And I had forgotten actually the origin story of that essay with Richard Fagan, and I got really mad all over again. So this is a good time to be angry, I guess. So we want to pause here before we get to Joslyn's collection to kind of lay the groundwork further with a few considerations. Now, we've titled this conversation, There Have Been Great Women Artists, but we want to point your attention to the importance of language and how we frame these kinds of conversations. So I want to start with an anecdote. Now, if you've heard me talk about Helen Frankenthaler before, who I sometimes refer to as my personal queen, you've probably heard this little story. So it's 1964, and at this point, you have to understand that Frankenthaler was an established and highly regarded figure in the New York City art world. So she does an interview with a gentleman who was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum by the name of Henry Geltzoller. And he asks her during this interview how she feels about being, quote, a woman painter. And Frankenthaler, without skipping a beat and certainly not one to pull punches, responds, well, obviously, I am first involved in painting, not the who and the how. So what she's pointing to is the almost absurdity of using language like saying she's a woman artist, because you would never say, well, Picasso, he was a male artist, right? It sounds ludicrous even coming out of the mouth. So why don't we apply that to kind of marginalized communities within the arts? Why do we say women artists? Why do we say Black artists? Why do we say Native American artists? So we're working on kind of flipping the script a little bit. And while it might be clunky to say artists who are women, it feels like it hits more a right note and starts to kind of get to that equality issue. And I want to also note here that when we are referencing women, we're talking about individuals who self-identify as women. So we're trying to be kind of further inclusive in that language. Taylor, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the slide you saw at the very beginning with our names on it featured an artwork that I'll get back to in just a moment by the Guerrilla Girls. And talking about the Guerrilla Girls sort of helps you understand from the 1980s on what this shifting landscape with regard to gender parity in institutions, arts institutions looked like. So the Guerrilla Girls was born in 1985 out of a demonstration that had emerged surrounding an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art titled An International Survey of Painting and Sculpture. And the show was framed as a survey of the most significant contemporary art of the time. But of course, it was not quite so equal in its representation. There were 148 men, 13 women, and 0 artists of color. And then the curator sort of compounded this already troubling framework by saying in an interview that anyone who wasn't included in the show should, quote, rethink his career. So this is, you can tell why this is problematic and why there might have been some resistance to this. So the demonstration starts kind of in a traditional way with traditional protest tactics. They were handing out flyers, walking in a circle, chanting outside the building. But a subset of those individuals decided this wasn't impactful enough. And they wanted to form a smaller group that could be more nimble and more responsive. And this led to the birth of the Guerrilla Girls. So they are an anonymous feminist art protest group, and they've been devoting their careers to combating misogyny and racism in the visual arts. And along with that, compelling other artists, as well as critics in museums and galleries, to acknowledge that rampant gender and racial inequality exists in the art world. So they have staged letter writing campaigns, they create print ephemera like what you're looking at here, they make public appearances, they go to protests, and then this is all backed up by this really kind of wonderful, aggressive PR campaign. Taylor, can I get the next slide, please? So this is an image from 1989. So to remain anonymous, this group, when out in public, would wear gorilla masks over their heads, and they adopted pseudonyms that made reference to deceased artists who are women. And all this was in an effort to conceal their identities. They wanted to emphasize issues over personalities. One of their early tactics, which has been quite successful, is gathering statistics from arts institutions to provide evidence of gender and racial disparity. So they would put up posters in the middle of the night in New York's Soho neighborhood, which is where many of the galleries were in the 80s. And they would just sort of simply state facts like less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. So they're really putting everyone on alert. They're calling out galleries that don't show enough female artists or artists who are female, but they're also letting everyone know that they're kind of being examined, that their records are going to be on display. So this work reproduces the French neoclassical artist Ingres's kind of famous painting Grand Odalisque, donning a gorilla head, of course. And I think it perfectly encapsulates this sort of poppy style of the Guerrilla Girls, these bright colors, compelling graphics, astonishing statistics. And not long after making this work, the group adopted the motto, "Fighting discrimination with facts, humor, and fake fur." So this leads us into the question of what can a museum like Joslyn do, and what has a museum like Joslyn done in recent years? One little interesting stat that we pulled together in conversing the other day was that just since 2012 alone, we've brought in more than 60 works to the collection, so new acquisitions that were made by women, and that's a pretty good number for us. So it's a one spoke in a larger wheel, but this is work that we are continuing on with. Want to go to the next slide, Taylor?
So in addition to these kind of broader conversations about artists who are women and working as art historians who are women, we also wanted to focus on some key works from Joslyn Art Museum's collection. This still life is by Maria van Oosterwijk, an artist who was born in Noorddorp, a village near Delft in the south of Holland. And she was the daughter of a clergyman, and little is known about her early training. Unique for a woman working as a professional artist of the time, Van Oosterwijk was not the daughter of a painter. In 1660, she moved to Utrecht, where she likely studied with the still life painter Jan Davids de Heem. And then in 1666, she went to Amsterdam, where she likely encountered the prominent still life painter Willem van Elst, though the nature of their relationship is still not known, and contemporary accounts vary. There is a dispute recorded between Van Oosterwijk's and Van Elst's housemaids concerning a coat. And this report developed into an anecdote about a refused proposal of marriage, which was repeated in several biographies and even elaborated into a romance novel in the 19th century, as well as an English language short story called Love Among the Lilies that was published in both Chambers and Harper's in 1861. It begins, like a prisoned poet inscribing eloquent odes to liberty, Maria van Oosterwijk, pent in the center, a grim old frowning Delph, strove passionately to fix upon her canvas glorious flowers and fruits. The story goes on to gesture at kind of a caricature of Maria van Oosterwijk as productive, pious, and lonely. Only recently is a more fulsome portrait of her emerging. Active from about the 1660s until 1690, she enjoyed enormous success as a flower painter. In 1667, the Italian prince Cosimo III de' Medici announced that Van Oosterwijk's flower painting was just as good as the world-renowned Van Els. From there, her canvases were highly sought after by European royals. Despite her prodigious talent and her reputation, as a woman, she was never granted membership to the Painters Guild, and so she continued to work independently. There are relatively few extant examples of her works firmly attributed to her, perhaps owing to a history of misattribution, whether accidental or malicious, to male contemporaries. She painted lively and elegant floral still lifes filled with a diversity of flora. Her work is characterized by a unique style, a refined technique, especially thoughtful detail, careful lighting, and fine brushwork. And this is all evident in Joslyn Art Museum's painting, which was acquired just in 2019. Moving a bit forward in history, we're happy to have this painting by Maria Cassatt in Joslyn Art Museum's collection. An artist who was born in Pennsylvania, but spent much of her early years in France and Germany with her family. From 1860 to 1862, she studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, but as a woman, she was banned from live model drawing classes. And so frustrated, by 1865, she convinced her parents to let her study in Paris, where she took private lessons from the academic painters Jean-Léon Gérôme and Thomas Couture. In 1868, her painting, The Mandolin Player, was accepted for exhibition at the Paris Salon, which was quite a mark of distinction. From 1874, she settled in Paris, where she began to show regularly at the salons and befriend a coterie of avant-garde artists. In 1877, she was invited by Edgar Degas to join with an independent group of artists in exhibiting their work, a group later called the Impressionists. She was the only American officially associated with the group. She also sent paintings back to exhibitions in the United States, making hers among the first Impressionist works to be seen in this country. And by advising wealthy American patrons on acquisitions, she also played a really important role in shaping taste and some of the most important collections of Impressionist art in America. During the late 1870s and 1880s, the subjects of her work were mostly her family, especially her sister Lydia, the theater, also the opera, and she especially focused on scenes of mothers and children. This is one of many paintings by Maria Cassatt depicting a modern woman reading. It is exemplary of her interest in sharing the sort of rich lives of modern women, mostly within their own domestic spheres. Some scholars have identified the sitter in this painting as Lydia, Cassatt's sister, who often sat for portraits. However, more recent research suggests that the sitter was more likely a Swedish model whom the artist hired to pose for this and other paintings.
There are so many connections, especially I'm thinking about the Van Oosterwijk painting and just this process of archival discovery that sort of required to follow the reattributions of her paintings. I think there's sort of a similar process in my research with Native art collections. And I was reading Nochlin's essay, and her name doesn't come up that often in Native art history. And I think there's some pretty interesting just field differences that are the reason for this. And I wanted to bring up one statement of hers. She has this fabulous line of how women respond to this question, why have there been no great women artists? And she says, the feminist's first reaction is to swallow the bait, hook, line, and sinker, and to attempt to answer the question as it is put. That is, to dig up examples of worthy or appreciated women artists. They do nothing to question the assumptions lying behind the question. I think this is just fascinating because what I'm seeing in my field is that you have to do both. And I think Nochlin, she's not saying that we shouldn't do this historical research, and she sort of changes her position later on in her career. But in Native art, you know, the majority of the collection that I steward is made by women. I mean, I couldn't give an exact percentage, but most beadwork, quill work, ceramics, most of those art forms are traditionally women's arts. So, and of that, you know, huge percentage of artworks, there are very few artists who are actually named. Most of these items were collected and they were seen as crafts. So this like art versus craft distinction, which Nochlin does talk about a little bit, has really, really hurt the field of Native art. So digging into these histories really involves sort of reviving biography and doing but also about her community. I'm bringing in two works to share because they tell very interesting stories about how Native women were innovators in their fields. So this first painting is by Tonita Pena. Her name is Kwa'a, and she was born at San Ildefonso Pueblo and eventually moved to Cochiti Pueblo. And she's sort of acknowledged as the first Native woman painter. So the first woman who's working in this easel painting tradition. And she's part of this group of Pueblo artists who were self-taught painters, sort of at the encouragement of Anglo anthropologists. And so when she was in school, she was asked to produce images of ceremonies and of her own experiences. So she did this throughout her life. She had 6 children, supported them. She had several husbands who died tragically. So she really supported her family and her art. And these paintings, painting of ceremonies, mostly women's ceremonies. So here you're seeing a corn dance. And then she was the first Native woman artist whose painting was acquired by the Whitney Museum of Art. And this was in 1931. And it was acquired at a record price, which was $225 at that point in time. And so, you know, dealing with Native women art history, there's this very complicated overlay of how the primarily white art market and white institutions validate Native women's arts. And so that's primarily lied in painting. Next slide, please, Taylor. So I brought in this incredible multi-figure sculptural work by Roxanne Swensel, who's from Santa Clara Pueblo. And it's dealing with this similar theme. She's showing women who are preparing for a corn dance or a harvest dance. And it's this very just lovely, intimate scene. And it's information because you can see on the right, you know, one woman is starting to put on her moccasins, and then as you kind of move towards the left, you see a woman in her full regalia, and she's undergone this spiritual transformation. And I bring in Swensel because when she talks about her art, she really speaks to her experience as a Pueblo woman and how important it is to her art that she draws on this culture, on her cultural background. So she speaks a lot to clay and how clay as a product of the earth is something that not only creates these artworks, you know, these freestanding figures that are very much made for a Western art market, but also they create vessels. They serve humans. And, you know, you can also see in a comparison of these two, just the transformation and the innovations in Native women's arts, which I think is often overlooked when you have, you know, a collection of largely anonymous women. It's sort of easier to peg them in this craft category or to overlook the true innovations that have happened in Native arts. I could talk extensively about this. Yeah, I think we should open it up, you know, the three of us can have a larger conversation. Oh.
Yeah, I've got a couple to talk about. I was gonna say, I could listen to you talk all day about this stuff. So I'm going to briefly go through a couple of things from the collection. One work that represents kind of the early side of Joslyn's post-war collection, and then one work that represents the more recent side. And in listening to Taylor talk about Mary Cassatt, I was reminded how much she and Kay Sage have in common in their sort of life stories. Kay Sage was born to a wealthy family in Albany, New York. And when her parents split, her mother took her to Europe, and she spent most of her time growing up there. And finally moves to Paris when she's in her 30s. And this is when she is exposed to surrealism for the first time. So Kay Sage becomes one of very few women. I think there were 15 or 16 women officially associated with surrealism, which actually makes it, for the time, a more gender inclusive art movement than the world had really seen, especially the European art world. But it was still absolutely patriarchal, and it was kind of led or spearheaded by André Breton, who reportedly, when he saw Kay Sage's paintings for the first time in 1938, commented that they were so good and strong that they must have been made by a man. So here we see not a lot changing from Van Osterwijk's days, when people were attributing her work to a male because they were so good, to 1930s Paris, despite, again, the sort of the play at gender parity that existed in surrealism. So Sage is often talked about in the same conversation as the man who would become her second husband, Yves Tanguy, who was a very highly regarded surrealist artist. Interestingly, I guess she was officially not part of the group, but was sort of considered to be one of the guys because of her relationship with Tanguy. And this is something that she really pushed back against throughout her career. So she was in the process of developing this really distinct visual lexicon that certainly borrows a lot from the kind of absurdism we associate with surrealism. But it's also a distinct language in that it has references to sort of like mid-century American modernism. There's the grid and the lines. There's this really subdued color palette, which was not common for the surrealists. So she's in the process of trying to build out her reputation as this individualized artist, and people continually want to put her in the same box as Tanguy. So in 1954, there's a joint exhibition of the two artists in upstate New York. No, excuse me, it was at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Connecticut. And they showed the two artists together, but in separate spaces. And when I first read this, when I first researched this work, I thought, well, this seems like you're really kind of countering what you're proposing to do, which is put these two artists on the same playing field. But apparently it was Sage herself who was really reticent to show alongside Tanguy. And this kind of reminded me, you go back to Linda Nochlin's essay, why have there been no great women artists? Why don't we look at Sage and say she's a great woman artist? Part of it is she was kind of forcing herself back into the shadows and sort of rejecting that notion because she thought it would too closely associate her with the establishment, and that's not who she was interested in being. So you see this kind of push and pull between artist and institution here. And this is just a really wonderful kind of early example from the post-war collection. We're lucky to have this kind of tie the collection together. Taylor, can I have the next slide, please? And the last work we're going to directly address tonight is Mickalene Thomas. So we brought this work into the collection in 2019. We've been talking sort of about the suppression of female voices. Of course, the underrepresentation of artists of color in art museums and in galleries and in exhibitions for generations is also well documented. And I was thinking about, when I think about this painting, and I think about Linda Nochlin, I go back to Toni Morrison. She's got this great quote. That in the greater battle for equality, the Black woman has had, quote, nothing to fall back on, not maleness, not whiteness, not ladyhood, not anything. And out of the profound desolation of her reality, she may very well have invented herself. So again, speaking to this notion that in order to be considered great, you sort of need to establish yourself in that position. And this is a kind of a burden that an artist like Mickalene Thomas, I think, really bears. I don't know that I'm going to talk too much about the content of this work right now. I've talked about this a lot in the last couple of years. I'm happy to field questions about it, but I sort of wanted to put that idea on that kind of extra layer on the table of if we're talking about the silencing of women, we have to consider in particular the silencing of Black women. How are we in time? Should we open up for conversation here at 6 o'clock? We'd love to have some questions. You can feel free to drop them in the Q&A there on the bottom right of your screen. No questions tonight, huh? Oh, we've got one. Oh, that's not a question, sorry.
Well, I have a question for the two of you. Sorry, Karin.
No, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, in your curatorial work, or as you just started out in the field, what some of the inspiring examples that you saw were in a museum, how a museum curated an artist who was a woman, how they did a thematic show about artists who were women, if there's something that really stood out to you, an example from another institution.
Yeah, actually, one of the most formative exhibitions for me as a young, not yet curator, thinking that's the direction I wanted to go, was this great survey of Ana Mendieta's work that was at the Hirshhorn and the Des Moines Art Center and the Whitney. And Ana Mendieta's work was very much grounded in her femininity and her womanhood and her body and her relationship to the earth. And so you can't do a show like that without foregrounding, first of all, the fact that she was a woman, but also that she was a pioneering artist in this regard, right? Like there have been plenty of land artists, but how many were marrying their body to the earth? And I thought the show was so expansive and thoughtful in how it treated her as both a woman and as a great artist and as a great woman artist. You know, like it was just sort of this, like all the kind of perfect alignment of the stars and what it was to highlight that work of an individual like that.
I'm gonna go back a little further, and instead of talking about an exhibition, what came to mind was the first time I read this essay and the context in which I read Linda Nochlin's essay. And it was as a sophomore in college at Dartmouth College in a course called Women Artists 1500 to 2000. And you know, it was very early in my tenure of studying art kind of more formally within the context of an art history course, but also this idea of that there were enough women to build a class around when I could only name a handful prior to that moment. And the professor of that course, the late Angela Rosenthal, who was a scholar of Angelica Kaufman, was really instructive in offering these kind of alternative narratives. And she invited Linda Nochlin to come and sit with our group of mostly young women art historians who were taking the course to talk about the essay and talk about what had changed in the intervening years. And so that was really powerful for me, not just around what Linda in the essay calls the woman problem, or we might better call the woman question, but just about opening up art history to think beyond this idea of the spark of genius to really address the social history, the intellectual and cultural context, which really I think makes all of our work so rich, and is what we endeavor to do when we kind of tell the stories of these artworks, whether it's in an essay or in the gallery. I think now we have a few questions from guests, if I can pull these up.
There's one that I saw and I'd like to take on from Diane Seaver. Do you think it's important to consider that a woman is the artist when critiquing? And then she rephrased, how should we as a viewer consider the artist's background as part of the context? So for Native art, it's really important because so many art forms are gendered. I work specifically with the 19th century, and when I'm talking about quill work, for instance, this is embroidery made of porcupine quills. Women had societies, or essentially guilds, for quill working, and they had to be trained since very early age. Oftentimes this was linked to dream imagery. So they were very sacred individuals, really special people who were part of these societies, and that it was women's work. So it is important just in that cultural context. I think speaking to contemporary artists who are Indigenous, I would probably ask them individually, you know, how they feel that's important, their experience is important, what that brings to their artwork. But I think in doing this very focused research in the 19th century, it's a very important question for me to consider.
Yeah, and I think that you could actually say the same thing about artists who are men. Like the idea that there's this sort of biographical thread of telling art historical narratives. It needs to be a case-by-case basis. In some scenarios, you absolutely need to take background and history and education and influences and all of that into, you need to weight it more than you would maybe with others. So the answer to that question is, for me, more simply even yes and no. Just quickly want to address this. Debbie Burchard asked who again, and then said my name. I think that is with regard to the exhibition I mentioned. Anna, A-N-A, Mendieta, M-E-N-D-I-E-T-A. She passed in 1985. She was pushed out the window of her apartment in 1985 by her then husband, Carl Andre, who is now a very famous artist. It is incredible. The catalog for that exhibition is one of my favorite books I've ever owned. So highly recommend it. Okay, let's see. Sally Otis asks, what do you feel are notable voids in Joslyn's collection in respect to artists who are women? Everywhere, all over the collection.
For the Native art collection, the void is just not knowing the names of the women. And it's so important to bring that into the conversation. And as a curator, I try to find ways to even acknowledge that on the label, by talking about this is the information that we do have. Ongoing, and that just involves conversations with members of the community too, and figuring out who these makers were.
Janet Keel, hi Janet, miss you, has asked about the Riley Cap Gallery and if we are seeking artists who are women, if that's a factor. I would be lying if I said it's not kind of always a factor for when I'm thinking about putting exhibitions together, whether it's multi-person shows or for the Riley Cap Gallery. It was not an accident that we inaugurated that space with an exhibition by an artist who is both a woman and Black. And because part of our ongoing mission is, elevating voices that we feel have been historically underrepresented in both the arts in general and at Joslyn specifically. So yeah, I'm constantly thinking about balance and bringing out as many kind of not white, not male voices as I can, quite frankly.
I see someone has asked if there's a Jane Gardner Bouguereau in Joslyn's collection, and there is. Elizabeth Jane Gardner Bouguereau was born in New Hampshire and then moved to Paris, where she studied with Jules Joseph Lefebvre, who's also represented in Joslyn's collection, and then was a student of William Adolph Bouguereau's, became his paramour after the death of his wife. And then after his mother died, who fiercely objected to their union, she became his second wife. And so we do have one painting of a mother and child by Elizabeth Jane Gardner Bouguereau. And she's kind of one of those artists who lived a very international life and an American, but her painting is exhibited within the European galleries.
With regard to collecting and what's in the collection, we have a couple of kind of related questions here. Erica Gaffney and Joseph Liebendrit. So does Joslyn have an explicit mission to acquire works by women and or other groups that have been traditionally underrepresented in art museums? Yes, we do. And I think this sort of ties into the previous discussion or previous question that I answered. We kind of talk about our approach to amplifying previously silenced voices as a multi-pronged thing, or many spokes on a wheel. So one spoke is temporary exhibition programming. That includes the Riley Cap Gallery, but also, of course, the larger exhibition space. Permanent collection acquisitions, interpretation. So this is a good opportunity to debut a brand new project that we're doing called Omaha Speaks that will be going live next week. Each of us has invited 6 members of the community who are people of color to offer their reflections and responses to works across the collection. So that'll be available both in the permanent collection spaces, so in the physical space, and also online. So take a look for the header Omaha Speaks. And then the final spoke is programming. So, we we know it's important, and that we have kind of a unique responsibility at this moment to be diversifying across the board. And, you know, I don't know that it's explicitly part of the mission, but it is absolutely part of our mission and what we intend to do. Okay. So Georgia O'Keeffe, is her work too obviously feminine, or are they perhaps afraid of her work? I mean, yeah. Yes to both. You know, I mean, we're asked about kind of gaps in the collection. A great O'Keeffe would actually fit really well in the context of our American painting collection. Let us know if you're interested in helping to acquire one. We're accepting donations. What are you planning to do to highlight the artists who are women here at Joslyn and on an ongoing basis? Yeah, I think, Barbara, thank you for the question. And that goes back to our previous conversation about the multi-spokes on the wheel. Karen Riley. Hi, Karen. Can you tell us more about, Ana Mendieta? Yeah. So Ana was a Cuban-American artist who came to the States as part of Project Peter Pan during the Cuban Revolution. So her father was a defector, and she and her sister were sent to the United States for safekeeping. She actually landed in Iowa. So she went to college in Iowa. She did some of her earliest work incorporating her body into the landscape in Iowa. So it's being in the middle of the country was sort of special for me the first time I came out here, because you know, I have sort of this image I have of the Midwest had been filtered for a long time through Ana Mendieta. And then she goes on to become a fixture in the New York City art world in terms of the kind of younger artists and other artists, even of her age group, looking to her because she was doing things completely outside of the traditional studio practice and traditional gallery practice. So her work dealt with her experience of being displaced from home. It dealt with her kind of female body being torn between this place and that, never feeling like she belonged anywhere she lived. So she was working in photography, in video, and in sculpture, really across media, to think about how she could kind of reconnect her body to the earth. And then, as I mentioned, she died tragically too young. So
I'll take a question. Any plans from Barbara? Any plans to consider local artists are female? Yes, so this is something, because I specialize in the 19th century, which is, you know, what are called historical artworks, but are actually part of this continuation of art making. There are still beadworkers, quill workers, sewers who are innovating in styles that have been, and methods that have been around for a long time. So a big part of my job is talking to contemporary I've worked with women who are part of the Sewer Guild that's affiliated with the New York College, you know, as well as with elders, specifically around conversations around Indigenous languages and how to talk about art and incorporate Indigenous languages into that practice. So for me, I've been trying to bring in contemporary artists to reflect on the work that we do have in the Native art collection, which is primarily from, you know, the early 20th century or prior to that. And it's just been incredible and very illuminating to have their perspectives included in that.
I see one with someone asking if there are any other Impressionist painters who are women in Joslyn Art Museum's collection other than Mary Cassatt. And I'm sad to share that there are not. But we're very pleased to have the Mary Cassatt that we do have. And it's shown in a gallery in the context of kind of a broader discussion about Impressionism near our sculpture by Degas and 2 paintings by Monet.
There's a question about 30 Americans and the sort of importance of language, I think. Why was 30 Americans, the exhibition from the Rubel family collection that we staged in 2019, called 30 Americans and not 30 Black Americans? And the answer is really pretty simple. When the Rubel family was putting together that show for the first time in 2008, they'd spent a lot of time with the artists represented in the exhibition. They had personal relationships with a lot of them, and were sort of talking about what it meant to make an exhibition of all kind of one subgroup, because it is sort of inherently otherizing. And the rebels thought that if they labeled the show 30 Black Americans, then you would come to the exhibition with the sort of set of preconceived notions about what you were going to see, which is, you know, identity politics and responses to stereotyping and race and all of these things that the show does address. But it kind of pries open space for interpretation if you don't go into the show assuming you know everything based on this one identifying factor of this group of people. And there's one final question, I think, directed to all of us here. Modern take on a classic question for a bit of fun. Which artist, who is woman, thank you, Diane, for correcting that. Which artist, who's a woman, living or dead, would you want to have coffee with? Taylor, you want to start?
That's so hard. I'm thinking of many, but because I've spent so much time studying the Van Osterwyk painting in the last couple of years, I'm going to have to go with Maria Van Osterwyk. And I think more so too because we know so little about her life story and her background for why she entered into painting. And, you know, I've talked about this in a lot of other talks that floral still lifes can be so laden with symbolism and meaning. And so I would love to ask her, you know, about specific choices and about her methodology for combining all of these different flowers in different states of bloom that wouldn't have been available at the same time. So I'm going to say Maria Van Osterwyk.
This is so hard, but what came to mind, especially when you were talking about Osterwyk's florals, we have this really beautiful young boy's jacket that's quilled and it's covered with quill work embroidery, like the sleeves, the front, the back, all of these really elaborate floral designs that are symmetrical, and florals can tell stories, and they usually honor the individual, and they can tell the stories of the maker, the person who wore it. And it's a young boy's jacket, and it's just so luxurious. I know that it was made for a special occasion, so I would just love to talk to her and ask her who she made this for, and, you know, ask her about the imagery too. Florals can mean a number of different things, and yeah.
I have two answers. One is Kara Walker, because the only time I met her was very briefly and in passing, and my palms were so sweaty, and because I was so enamored, I still am so enamored and amazed by her and her presence and her brilliance, that I didn't, like, all I could stumble out was like a hello and a quick handshake, and then I ran away. The other is more personal. It's Sheila Hicks, because I love her so much, and I haven't been able to see her in a very, very long time. And she's an artist who I grew really close to when making her exhibition for Joslyn. So I would die for a cup of coffee in Paris next to Miss Sheila. I think we are now officially out of time. Hillary, I was going to throw it back to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That was great. And I saw Judy Bolts just said, wonderful plug in for Sheila Hicks, right, when you were saying that. So that's so great. Thanks, Judy. Thank you to all three of you for this wonderful program. We did record it, and it will go back out to more of our members at a later time. So if you want to watch it again, or encourage anyone of your other member friends to watch. Also, just thank you to everyone who participated tonight for your support. Support from our members and donors are what help us get through every year, especially this year that we've all been suffering through with COVID. So we appreciate all you're doing for us. I did see a few other questions come through, and we'll make sure we get those to the curators for a few answers via email. So thank you again, and have a really great night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.